So I'm actually like on location today. I'm on Santa Cruz Islands, which is off the coast of Southern California, and I'm about to begin a time lapse that I expect to run for about 25-26 hours. So I'm gonna get it all set up and I'm gonna show you how I do it. When you're setting up a camera to run for an extended period of time, like a day or more, there's a lot of pre-planning that goes into it. So I started earlier this week because I knew I was coming out here, but I didn't know if I wanted to bother bringing all my equipment, checking the weather and checking to see whether it was going to be clear at night, to see whether I was going to get a good shot of the sky. The next big obvious consideration is, of course, where you're going to put your camera. The place that I'm hiking to right now is a location that I actually selected by wandering around the island on Google Earth VR for a couple hours a few days ago before leaving home. And I visited there once in real life last night and decided that it looked like a good spot. So when you're trying to put a camera somewhere for a long time, unless you literally want to sit with the camera for 24 hours straight, which I've done, it's not fun, it needs to be sort of out of the way where you know it's not going to be bothered. But ideally it's close enough that you can go check on it if you want. So this is about 2 miles from camp. Oh man, I'm going uphill. In this case, I want a good view of the southern sky so that I can see the Milky Way rise at about midnight. And I wanted to be able to get some of the mountains, but an actual ocean horizon due south. And here we are. It looks pretty much just like what I saw in the Google Earth VR thing. I wish that mountain was a little taller. It's going to take up more of the frame, but my lens should be able to go from here and all the way out to Anacapa Island about here. So I should get a really nice wide field of view, nice big view of the southern sky. I'm a little bit off of the trail. There's a very slight ridge on the edge of a trail, and where I put the tripod, I don't think it's going to be visible from the trail right next to it, which is going to be great. There is a little bit of a local hazard, I would say, in the foxes which are here, which are great, but they get into everything, they steal your food, and I don't want them to get into my camera, so I'm gonna probably take some steps to avoid that. Everything you need for a time lapse. Keep it real low to avoid the wind. Real wide base. The wind here is nasty. But I don't want it so low that I make life easy for the foxes to just grab the top of the camera. So I've got a Sony a6000 with one of these Samyang 12mm f2s. Unfortunately, because I'm also going to be shooting during the day, I'm actually going to have to run this at f2.8, so it's not going to be quite so bright in the dark. Lens cap. All right, made myself a list. I'm not going to explain all of the settings right now because that would take forever, but feel free to pause and look at everything. The important part is that the camera needs to be able to automatically adjust to really extreme changes in lighting. During the day, the sun is literally shining focused onto the sensor, but at midnight, the camera needs to be able to soak up as much light as possible to resolve the Milky Way. I do this by putting the camera in aperture priority, where the exposure can range between 30 seconds and 1/4000th of a second, and allowing the ISO to vary between 100 and 1600. I've also in the past manually turned the aperture ring a few notches at sunrise and sunset, but since walking 2 miles up a mountain at 5 a.m. in the dark isn't really on my short list, today I'm just locking the aperture at 2.8. One trick when you're leaving a camera for a really long time that I find helpful, at least reassuring that when I'm putting on the rest of the camera harness I don't screw anything up, is to put a piece of tape and wrap it all the way around the focus ring and aperture ring so that once you have the settings that you want locked in, they are indeed locked in. And it's only blue tape, so if it leaves any residue in the heat, it's not like you're using duct tape or electrical tape or something, you know? Now it's at 2.8, infinite focus, and that's not going to change until I take this tape off. Next is the intervalometer. So you got to be able to trigger the camera on a regular period for a really long time. I don't know if newer cameras have this built in somehow, but I use an external intervalometer that I'm going to set to 1 minute and 20 seconds. So that gives me long enough to take a 30-second exposure at night. The limiting factor is the nighttime shots because they're really long. So it takes a 30-second exposure, and then it takes a 30-second dark frame, and then it takes 10 seconds or so to actually process, subtract those images, and then save one of them, or save the result. And minute 20 gives the camera just enough time to do that. So it's nearly the highest frame rate that I can get. It's also divisible by both 1440 minutes in a solar day and 1436, I guess, minutes in a sidereal day. So whether you want to sync from day to day with the sun or sync from day to day with the stars, you can do it on a 1 minute and 20 timer. Got to pick some batteries. Got, yeah, 1.5 volts. Excellent. I'll wait 5 seconds, press the shutter for 1 second, and then I want to wait for 1 minute and 20 seconds. And I want to take an infinite number of shots. And I do not need audio. And remember to lock the intervalometer so that it doesn't, you know, turn off when a fox comes by and bumps one of the buttons. Always check this for at least a couple frames and listen for the camera and whatnot. Make sure it's actually taking pictures. There we go. Look at that. So the next camera settings that you need are really the last things that you're going to do on the camera to make sure the camera is consuming as little power as possible so that your batteries last as long as they conceivably can. Here, the viewfinder, I have read, actually sucks more power than running the whole back screen. So I'm going to turn off the viewfinder and then turn the back screen to minimum brightness. There we go. Now I can't see squat, but the camera's not sucking any power either. So next I'm going to put on this, which is my custom anti-dew heater. I'll probably head through here at some point this evening and flick a switch so that it at least gets the lens a little bit warmer. We had a lot more dew than I was anticipating in the morning, and I know that the battery that I'm going to use to run this won't last all night. I run everything off of these USB battery packs. I've got 2 of them. One's going to run the camera, one's going to run this heater. And there we go. Heater's off. So I can plug this in. I will have 5 volts ready to go as soon as I press the button. So this button's all sort of rusted out and gross, but it should still work. I don't know. So this is the power pack that I'm going to use to run the camera. It is a 20 amp hour 5 volt USB power supply, and I'm going to run it through this thing, which is the case relay. It's like a UPS for your camera because you can hot switch power supplies to it, and it's got a battery inside. And it plugs into the camera with this dummy battery. So in a minute I'm going to take out the regular battery and I'm going to put this in, and then it will officially be on external power. It's like, it sounds like switching over a rocket to external or to internal power before you launch it or something. Battery, fake battery. Battery that comes with an included cable. And the next step is to take this big umbilical of cables and these things and like everything about the camera and tie it down and weatherproof it as much as humanly possible. All right, the lights turn on. They did. They're officially on external power. So I get the umbilical of cables running down off the camera, and I run that down a leg of the tripod, and I put all this stuff in a bag. So I've got the power supply for the camera, power supply for the heater, case relay for the camera, and the intervalometer all sealed up in a bag. The final step, and arguably the most important, is weatherproofing the camera itself. You don't want your camera to get ruined if it like spontaneously were to rain. To that end, I have another Ziploc bag here that I'm going to cut up, wrap around the camera. I'm going to pack some paper towel in there as a really janky desiccant, I guess. It makes me feel better. Silica gel would probably be better. And then a relatively recent find is that this camera overheats in the bright sunlight, and tinfoil actually makes a big difference in insulating the camera against the sun. And also the winds were 30 mile an hour last night. I think sustained actually. So I want to make all of this wrapping much smaller than I normally do so that it doesn't act as a sail and this camera gets ripped away by the wind. I also really don't want to let any of this stuff blow away and leave the camera while I'm not here to catch it, because then I'd be littering on this like completely perfect pristine island. That would be bad. That would be really bad. You can buy stuff for this too, but you know, Ziploc is cheap. Shiny side out, shiny side in. I gotta remember my thermal. I want it to reflect heat and absorb heat on the inside. Shiny side out. That doesn't look funny at all. You'd have to remove all this foil to actually see what sort of pictures the camera was taking. I guess I've done enough of these that I sort of trust it. It's scary. As a final touch, put a sign on it that says "Don't disturb." But that's basically the setup. Just a tripod in the middle of nowhere with a bag hanging off of it and a camera completely wrapped in foil. Probably give the lens a wipe too. I almost forgot the fox mitigation. I'm going to put some of this tape upside down, looped around the legs of the tripod. At least that works on like dogs and cats to keep them off of countertops and stuff because they don't like the tacky tape. I don't know about wild foxes. Okay, so I came back up here to the camera. The sun just went behind the mountain, which means that it's going to start to get cold. And when it gets cold, water condenses and you get dew on optics, which is bad. What I need to do is flip that switch. So now my dew heater is on, and that ring of resistors that I wrapped around the lens is going to be active. And it's only a few watts, which especially in this wind, I'm not sure is going to do a whole lot of good. But the lens really only needs to be a couple degrees above ambient for dew to settle on everything else and not it, because the dew point and temperature will track each other down as dew falls. Ball of foil on a stick. It's not gone yet. Gotta hear if it's still clicking. This case has to be 1,000,000 degrees. That's not that bad. Ah, that was a click. Neat, it's still running. We just have to find out if it fogged up overnight. It probably did. A lot of dew last night on the tent. Oh, that still has charge. Does that mean that the heater didn't go off? Maybe that switch is janky. Shoot. This button's all sort of rusted out and gross, but it should still work. I don't know. Oh, no. That's not what I wanted to see. All right. Moment of truth. Oh, except I gotta turn the screen brightness back up. Wow, there's a lot of light coming from over there. Oh, that's awesome. Got the Milky Way going right through the frame. I aimed right. I gotta zoom in and see if I have fog. This might just be a really good coating on this lens. That's what I'm gonna hope for. I will most certainly be copying these RAWs to like 30 billion different locations when I arrive at home tonight. And then processing them this week. Lens isn't even that crummy. So even with the heater malfunction, the images came out great, with no lens fogging, wind vibration, or curious foxes messing with the setup. The TLDR of my time-lapse post-processing routine is to develop the entire batch of images twice, optimized for daytime and then optimized for nighttime. Then I blend those two time-lapses together in a video editor. Sometimes, if I have weird color noise or I need to distort the frame somehow, I'll also run the images through some MATLAB scripts that I've written for time-lapse work, but that gets really mathy and is outside of what I'm going to talk about here. The Tiny Planet time-lapse was by far the heaviest editing workflow I've ever needed, but today I'm working with a normal, non-fisheye lens, and despite being an eyesore, the lights from LA actually help to stabilize my white balance overnight, which makes this thing a whole lot easier. The first thing I'm doing here is just sort of getting a feel for the nighttime process to make the Milky Way look good. That's my #1 priority when editing nighttime shots. You can see that before I'm done, when I go look at the images after the moon rises, it looks really gross, like this overcranked HDR thing. So you've got to be really careful that all of your edits work on all of the nighttime images, because they get applied everywhere, whether they look good or not. I generally don't like using selective brushes and filters on images, but in this case the sky needed a bit more clarity, and I'm actually brushing over the land to eliminate the weird halo artifacts you get from applying lots and lots of clarity to the edges of hills and other contrasty edges. I could have done the same thing by only brushing the sky, I guess, instead of having canceling edits on the ground, but it ended up working just fine. Once the nighttime shot is the way you want it, let Lightroom churn away at exporting those images, because it's going to take a while. I normally make a copy of one edited image in Lightroom, so that I have the edits sort of saved somewhere. Then I select the whole time-lapse again and reprocess it for day. The severity of the overcranked contrast I use on the night sky would make daytime pictures look really bad, so I pretty much start from scratch here and make much more mild edits to get a reasonable daytime view, with hills, clouds, and whatnot all looking reasonable. Once you've got two complete sets of edited images, you can take those into your favorite nonlinear editor. I use daVinci Resolve front to back and love it, so if you haven't gotten into video editing much, I'd really recommend starting there. It's extremely powerful, and even after using it for years, I know that I probably am ignoring huge chunks of functionality, so don't be intimidated by it, but it really is great. I know there are programs like LR Timelapse that let you actually keyframe Lightroom-style corrections in sets of still photos, and you can do similar keyframed color grading in daVinci Resolve, but I do this weird fade thing because plain old still Lightroom processing is nice and familiar, so it makes it easy for me. To actually execute the fade, you just need to put both sets of pictures on the timeline on top of each other, and then let one fade out into the other at sunrise and sunset. The timing here is important. You want the change in your processing to be simultaneous with the change in camera exposure from day to night. I spent a long time trying to get this right, because if you don't time everything perfectly, you can end up with seriously weird looking transitions. I messed this up badly in the Polaris-centered time-lapse from a few years ago, resulting in a few frames of this bizarre red color at sunrise. Based on YouTube and Reddit comments, not very many people actually noticed it, but it really bothers me because I know it's there. Somewhere in here I also do a bit of correction for the grass in the foreground blowing around in the wind during the day. I made a manual 3-frame temporal blur by copying the daytime footage twice and shifting it forwards and back by 1 frame. I also cut out the land for this correction so that I blur the noisy grass without blurring and duplicating the relatively well-behaved clouds in the sky. This blurring is not really necessary, but I do like the look, and it makes the footage look sort of less violent somehow when there's lots of wind or people moving in the foreground. So that's how I'd process a sunrise or sunset, but I wanted to take this a step further and make it a loopable, full-day time-lapse, which, frankly, once you have everything else prepped like this, is the easy part. For that, I open up a new timeline and mark out exactly 1080 frames. Since I'm looping day to day, and the sun is in the sky, not night to night when the stars would be in the sky, I want to loop over 1 solar day, which is exactly 24 hours, or like I mentioned earlier, 1080 frames. After marking my end length, I cut off any bad frames at the start or end of the time lapse, and then I go out to that 1080 mark and cut the time lapse to length. But I don't throw that data away. I save those frames so that I can bring them back to the start of the time lapse and let the time lapse fade back into itself. And that's how it can keep looping forever. If your camera moved at all while filming, which is likely, you'll have to do some stabilization or drift correction at this point. In my case here, I apparently did a pretty good job of mounting the camera in the wind because there are only a few pixels worth of drift. So I manually keyframed a slight rotation and offset of like 2 pixels or something, and everything lined up close enough. Once you go through all of that, you get a time lapse that lasts for precisely 1 day and can loop forever. I really love it because it feels like you've just sort of saved this little slice of time from the world and you can keep playing it over and over. And for some reason, there's something really, really satisfying about that to me. The workflow is pretty complicated, both in software and hardware, especially like this one if you're out in the middle of nowhere on an island without very many people on it even. But the technical challenge in my mind is half the fun, and I think it's a blast. So I hope you learned something from this video, and if you use this technique to make a looping time lapse, let me know because I absolutely will want to watch it.